10 years ago, Maine's former Governor Joe Brennan appointed the son of an Irish Lebanese immigrant to the Senate seat vacated by Edwin Muskie. Today, that man stands before us as the Majority Leader of the United States Senate. The same qualities that propelled George Mitchell through college by age 20 and then on to Georgetown Law School at night while working full-time as an insurance adjuster have made Mitchell the most respected member of Congress for the past 2 years, according to a poll of his congressional staff. Of the congressional staff. It's retribution, George. He is described by his colleagues as bright, conscientious, honest, compassionate, and curious. Moreover, George Mitchell's rapid rise to leadership testifies to his ability to work and make compromises in an effective bipartisan manner. If I make a mistake, at least I know you're listening. As a former U.S. District Court judge, George has proved himself a man of principle. He learned the necessity of weighing both sides of an issue and passing impartial, objective judgment. Accordingly, George Mitchell supports Israel and a strong U.S. Israel relationship because it is in America's best interest to do so. He has championed our cause in the U.S. Senate, and we are grateful for his support and his leadership. Please join me in welcoming the Majority Leader of the U.S. Senate, George Mitchell.
Thank you very much, Monty, for your generous introduction. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your warm reception. I was taking notes as Tom was calling the roll, and I wish I could get this many senators to come to the Senate floor when we're in session. I want first to recognize one group that hasn't been recognized earlier, and that's the AIPAC delegation from Maine. It's a small but a vocal group. Why don't you stand up for a round of applause? I entered the Senate under unusual circumstances. As Monty indicated in his introduction, I was serving as a federal judge in northern Maine when Senator Muskie resigned from the Senate to accept the President's appointment as Secretary of State. The governor of Maine called me up and asked if I would accept the appointment to the Senate. First thing I did was to go to the library and check on the record of appointed senators. And I found to my dismay that in this century, almost everyone who's been appointed to the Senate was defeated at the next election. But notwithstanding that, and for reasons I'll explain in a moment, I accepted the governor's appointment. And I came to Washington 10 years ago this spring, in the middle of a legislative session. I knew I'd have a tough time to be elected, not only because of the record of appointed senators, but because I suffered another handicap in the political process. Nobody in Maine knew who I was. How many of you can name every federal judge in your state? That's how many people in Maine knew who I was. So I began the process of going back to Maine every weekend, traveling around the state, trying to meet and persuade a majority of my constituents to support me. I knew I'd be asked a lot of questions, and I wanted to be able to conceal my ignorance as effectively as I'd seen Senator Muskie and other politicians do over many years. So I read several books about the economy and the budget and the arms race. But as I traveled around the state in those first few months and early years, I found that while I was occasionally asked such questions, I was more often asked personal questions. How do you like being a senator after having been a federal judge? I was asked often. The two jobs are dramatically different. When I was a federal judge, you and everyone else in America were prohibited by law from trying to influence my decisions. If any of you had suggested that I vote a certain way then, you would have been committing a federal crime. Now that I'm a senator, you and everyone else in America are encouraged to try to influence my decisions. It's called participatory democracy, and I think few would disagree that we have the most active participating Democrats in the country right here in this room tonight. Why did you do it? I was asked over and over again, especially by my lawyer friends. Why would anyone in his right mind leave a federal judgeship, a position of security and prestige, to go to the Congress where there is neither security nor prestige? And I know that although this is a political meeting, there have got to be plenty of lawyers here because every American audience of 2 or more persons has at least one lawyer in it. It's usually the doctors who clap at that. Well, I began to tell a couple of stories, true stories, telling why I did it, and I'll tell one tonight. The reason I left the federal bench to go to the Senate. I was presiding as a federal judge in the Northern District of Maine. In February of 1980, I went to the office one day and it was 22 degrees below zero outside. When I get into the office, I happened to look at the newspaper before starting a trial that day, and I read where a group of 10 senators were going to Barbados to inspect American defense installations there. It struck me kind of funny because I'd been to Barbados and I didn't remember seeing a defense installation there. Later, when I got to the Senate, I checked and found out that there isn't one. So I asked a couple of the senators about it, and they said, well, we spent 2 weeks down there looking for one. And a little while later, I read in the paper that another group of senators were attending a conference in Tahiti. And the subject of the conference was, what is the effect of the Cold War upon the inhabitants of warm weather islands? And I thought to myself, this sounds like a place for me. So when the governor called me up and offered the appointment, I thought, why not? This sounds like a hell of a job. I get to travel all over the world. I won't have to work too hard. So I left the federal bench and came to the Senate with that expectation. I resigned as a federal judge very late one Monday night, about midnight, flew to Washington the next morning, took a taxi up to the Capitol. The Senate was in session. They interrupted the proceedings to swear me in, and then immediately resumed the proceedings, and 2 minutes later, a vote occurred. For those of you interested in trivia, and who isn't, I hold the all-time record in American history for having cast a vote the shortest time after having become a senator. That was the first of many informed judgments I've made in your behalf. The Senate was in session until midnight the first 4 nights I was here, and I began to think that perhaps I'd made an error in judgment in accepting the appointment, and I knew I'd made a big mistake. The next week, I'd been a senator 7 days, and a filibuster occurred. You're all politically active, so you know what that means, a controversial issue. One side wants to vote on it, one side wants to prevent a vote on it, and the result is round-the-clock sessions without pause. We came into session at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday morning and stayed in session for 4 consecutive days without a moment's pause. I was new then, naive. I thought I could actually learn something listening to a Senate debate. So I arrived at 7 o'clock in the morning, took my seat in the Senate chamber, and was surprised as I looked around to find that I was the only person in the entire room. After a while, 2 other senators came in and began what cannot even charitably be described as a debate. They were just killing time, going back and forth. I wanted to leave, but since I was the only person in the room, each speaker looked directly at me as he was speaking. And I thought it would be rude if I walked out, so I stayed. This went on for several hours, and then one of the senators wanted a break, and he called for a vote on a procedural matter. That's what one does in the Senate. When a break is needed, a procedural vote is called for. In the Senate, as you know, a loud bell rings announcing the vote. And within 15 minutes, each senator must personally come to the Senate floor and cast his or her vote. The bell rang, the back door opened. Into the Senate chamber poured about 95 senators. They all cast their votes, and they all left, including the 2 guys who'd been arguing. I stayed in my seat. After a while, 2 others came in. The process repeated itself all day, all night. For 24 consecutive hours, I remained in my seat in the Senate chamber doing what I thought was the nation's business. Now it was 7 o'clock the next morning. I was tired, hungry. I noticed on their occasional brief appearances in the Senate, the other senators didn't look as bad as I felt. So I said to the clerk, wherever they're going, I'd like to go, and whatever they're doing, I'd like to do. He said, Senator, it's no problem, come with me. He took me by the arm around behind the Senate chamber into a room much smaller than this, where to my amazement, I saw 100 narrow canvas folding cots set up of the type you find in emergency shelters. And there, lying there in their clothes, were the members of the United States Senate. One of the great disillusioning moments of my Senate career. It was very crowded, people coming and going. The clerk said to me, Senator, there's an empty cot in the middle, you better grab that one. So I started toward it. There were no aisles. I had to climb over other senators to get there. It was actually very exciting. It was the closest I'd ever been to such famous people until that time. I climbed right over Howard Baker. That wasn't easy. I next encountered Ted Kennedy. You've seen Ted tonight. That was before he went on a diet, and he posed a huge obstacle at that time. I finally got over him. I got to the empty cot, and I laid there, and I realized I had made the biggest mistake of my life. Wished I could go back to being a federal judge, but knew that I couldn't. And did what we all tend to do in such circumstances. I started feeling sorry for myself. And as I was lying there wallowing in self-pity, I looked and saw next to me, just a few inches away on the adjacent cot, Senator John Warner of Virginia. At that time, he was married to Elizabeth Taylor. So I looked at him and I thought, who am I to feel sorry for myself? I thought, here's a guy who could be home, legally in bed with Elizabeth Taylor, and he's spending the night with me. And that reminded me but what we all know but tend to forget. And that is, no matter how bad off you've got it, there's always someone who's got it worse. And we can go through life, feeling sorry for ourselves, complaining about things, wishing they were better, or we can do something about them. And that really is the ultimate reward of public service, the opportunity to do something about the problems that confront our society and that afflict people throughout the world. I'd like, for a few minutes, to talk about one of those problems in which we share a common concern. This afternoon, I joined with several of my colleagues in the United States Senate to introduce a resolution calling upon President Bush to suspend the dialogue with the PLO until that organization condemns the recent terrorist attack on Israel and expels Abu Abbas from its executive committee. We must keep our commitments, and we must insist that others keep their commitments to us. We support the peace process. We oppose terrorism. We cannot achieve the former by giving way on the latter. When the PLO, in December of 1988, pledged to recognize Israel's right to exist, to renounce terrorism, and to recognize United Nations Resolutions 242 and 338, our nation's response was the right one. Based upon those commitments, President Reagan initiated the U.S. dialogue with the PLO. I supported that decision. I still do. But if a dialogue is to produce results, all sides must honor their commitments. The attempted attack on Israeli civilians violates the PLO's pledge to renounce terrorism. The PLO's attempt to term the attack a military operation is unacceptable. As one participant in the attack admitted, the aim of the operation was to murder civilians. That's terrorism. There's no way around the term. By its actions, the PLO has jeopardized the dialogue with the United States. The dialogue can continue and bear fruit only if the PLO acts to sustain it. The PLO must unequivocally condemn the attack. It must expel Abu Abbas from its executive committee, and these steps must be taken immediately. With or without the dialogue, the search for peace must continue. War and terrorism, death and maiming serve no valid interest in the Middle East. Palestinians are no closer to self-determination. Israelis are no closer to peace and stability. Lebanese continue to suffer and die. I know the importance of peace to Israel. I also know that if true disaster in the Middle East is to be avoided, Palestinians must have some hope that their needs will be fairly addressed. As the leaders of the Israeli Defense Forces have said, there is no military solution to the Intifada. There is only a political solution. Now that a new government has emerged in Israel, Israel's friends in Congress hope it will be able to move forward in peace. Palestinians and Israel's neighbors must respond. An active peace process is essential. With each passing day, it becomes more obvious how essential it is as the situation grows more dangerous. The proliferation of ballistic missile technology is ominous. The question is no longer whether, but when chemical weapons and ballistic missiles will be joined. This demands action. In April 1988, I introduced the first congressional resolution condemning the use of chemical weapons in the Iran-Iraq war. I pointed out that Libya was not even on the U.S. list of countries barred from receiving chemical precursors, and urged the administration to put Libya in the same category as Iraq, Iran, and Syria. That warning is now even more significant in light of the recent acknowledgement by the administration that it is investigating reports that China has sold chemical weapons materials to Libya. The Libyan government sponsors terrorism and apparently finances the radical Palestine Liberation Front. This is the latest in a series of provocative actions by China in the Middle East. Weapons proliferation in areas of regional conflict serves no long-range interest. It does not lead to peace. It does not inspire negotiation. It only fuels the hope of each party that ever more sophisticated weapons will enable it to prevail. On such vain hopes, wars are waged, turmoil continues, and lives are lost. In the Middle East, almost 2 full generations of human beings have been born and matured in a state of war. Surely it is time for peace. The United States and Israel must work for that peace, to further trust, to encourage the peace process. Our nation has long and often been asked by other states to prove our good faith by pressuring Israel. Our nation has long refused, on the sensible ground that allies do not have to intimidate each other to entice others to become friends. Indeed, any nation which became a friend that way would have to soon wonder when its own turn to be pressured would come. So America has not accepted the premise that only by pressuring Israel can we demonstrate goodwill toward the Arab world. We ask instead that the Arab nations accept our friendship as it has always been offered, on the basis of mutual respect and goodwill. That is the basis of our relationship with Israel. Recently, after the tragic shooting of several Palestinians by a deranged Israeli, I was asked by a reporter if the relationship between the United States and Israel was in jeopardy. I have often been asked that question, usually after a fresh tragedy or crisis in the Middle East. Often the question is conveyed with anxiety, even dread. I believe the question misperceives the basis and the nature of the relationship between the two countries. In defining that relationship, in assessing it, certain basic points must be stressed. First, to state the obvious, we are Americans, and American policy toward Israel must be based on American interests. What we do in the Middle East and everywhere else must be based on understanding and advancing our interests. Second, it is in America's interest to maintain a close relationship with Israel. We are committed to democracy. We are pleased and gratified at the progress of democracy in Eastern Europe and in other parts of the world. One area that remains conspicuously deprived of democracy is the Middle East. There, the one functioning democracy is in Israel. It is in our interest to help maintain it. Third, the relationship between the United States and Israel is not a temporary political alliance for transitory objectives. It is deeper and more enduring than that because it is based on shared values and common ideals, democratic institutions, personal liberty, respect for the individual. Democratic institutions cannot survive and prosper without competition. We believe in our society that the surest way to devise policies in the national interest is to subject them to open, vigorous, competitive debate through the political process. In any democracy, there must be debate and there must be disagreement. That is true of the United States. It is also true of Israel. No one should be surprised or disheartened by that, for where there is no disagreement, there is no democracy. As there is disagreement within our two countries, there will inevitably be disagreement between our two countries. No one should be surprised or disheartened by that. As our policies must be based on America's interests, so must Israel's policies be based on Israel's interests. And though our interests frequently coincide, they are not always identical, nor should anyone expect them to be. These are simple and obvious principles, but I believe they need periodic restating and reaffirming, for too often they are forgotten in the heat of the latest controversy. The United States and Israel are two mature democracies, close friends and allies, sharing common ideals and values, who will nonetheless differ from time to time. But since our relationship is not based on any one objective, it is not threatened by any one disagreement. For that reason, the relationship is as secure and as strong as it has ever been. That's the way it should be, and that's the way it will be. Thank you very much for having me here this evening.
Thank you, Senator Mitchell. I'm Ruth Singer, one of 100 delegates here this evening from the city of Los Angeles. I want to tell you a story. Years ago, a young man was growing up in the backwoods of the Pacific Northwest. He knew no one in the Jewish faith, and he knew little about Israel. He went to high school and to college, the local high school. And there, too, he knew no one of the Jewish faith and knew little about Israel. And then he went to New York. He attended New York University Law School, and it changed his life. That young man was Bob Packwood, and students of AIPAC, let that be a lesson to you, that the student sitting next to you in your classrooms is a potential senator, a potential president. Senator Bob Packwood is a Republican from Oregon, first elected in 1968. Since coming to Washington, he has emerged as such an advocate of the pro-Israel legislation that the Congressional quarterly Politics in America identifies him as a crusader for Israel. "11 years ago, Bob Packwood was addressing this conference, this very same dinner, joining the ranks of such giants of the 1970s as Scoop Jackson, Hubert Humphrey, and Jacob Javits. In 1981, courageously, Senator Packwood spearheaded the effort against the sale of AWACS to Saudi Arabia, at great political risk, considering the popularity of the Republican president. Subsequently, he has led the successful fights against other dangerous arms sales to the enemies of Israel. As the former chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Senator Packwood played a major role in securing the passage of the United States-Israel Free Trade Agreement. He consistently votes in favor of aid to Israel, and he co-sponsored legislation demanding PLO compliance with the terms of the U.S. PLO dialogue. I know a teacher who keeps a sign on her desk that says, "Free knowledge given here, bring your own container." Senator Packwood, we have all brought our containers here tonight to learn from you, to benefit from your wisdom, your experience, and your counsel. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to present to you a great American leader, a great friend of Israel, and a great fan of the Portland Trail Blazers. Ladies and gentlemen, my friend, Senator Bob Packwood.
Good. Ruth, I had forgotten it was 11 years ago when I last spoke to this conference. I remember the speech. It was a whale of a good speech, I thought. I've had no invitation to come back since that time. I can't help but feel a little bit like the revenuer down in the hills of Kentucky. He's walking down the road, sees a young boy sitting alongside the road, whittling on a stick, and he says, "Morning, son." "Morning." "Where's your dad, son?" "Oh, he's up at the still." "Oh, up at the still?" "Mm-hmm." "Making whiskey?" "Mm-hmm." "Well, son, I'm very interested in that kind of business. Do you think you could take me up there and let me see his place of operation?" Kid nods, but he doesn't move, and he keeps whittling on the stick. And the revenuer said, "Well, son, I really would like to go up and see this. Can we go up now?" Kid says, "Yep," but he doesn't move. And finally, the revenuer, somewhat in frustration, says, "Son, let me tell you something. I'm a federal man. You can trust my word. Now, take me up there. When we come back, I'll give you $1." Kid says, "No, I want my $1 now, mister. You ain't coming back." Sort of the way I felt after that last conference when I spoke here. And you know, when Ruth mentioned NYU, that's a true story. It wasn't quite the backwoods. I was raised in Portland. I mean, it was not Yoncalla. But indeed, no Jewish background, no tradition, never met anybody named Cohen in all my life till I went off to NYU Law School. Then they called the roll. Abraham Cohen, Benjamin Cohen, David Cohen, Deborah Cohen. I mean, they have girls named Cohen in addition to boys. But the most enjoyable experience for me at NYU was not a Cohen, but a Berger, who is here tonight, Paul Berger, who was a classmate of mine and took me aside and taught me all of the lore and tradition, and most especially the love of the Jewish religion. Taught me the dietary habits, told me why people wouldn't work on Saturday. And he wouldn't work, wouldn't turn on the lights, wouldn't ride elevators, wouldn't make anybody else work on Saturday. And when it came time he could read by daylight, that was all right. So on Saturday, we lived on the 7th floor. On Saturday morning, when I would be going down to get the New York Times, he would ask me to get him a copy if I did not take the elevator. So down I'd go, 7 floors down, 7 floors back up, paid for the Times, gave him his Times. But he spent 3 years with me, teaching me the history and the tradition. I was there during the '56 war, and it was a stunning experience for a kid with no Jewish background to see the effect that it had on a school. It was probably 70–75% Jewish. So I left that law school a changed person because of the school, and especially because of Paul, back to Oregon. Never intended to stay there. Hoped to go back, hoped to go into politics, did. Finally came to the Senate, a committed zealot before I ever got to the Senate. And in the years that I've been there, nothing has changed in my judgment. I've been to Israel on a number of occasions, and each time I go, the fortification becomes stronger. And if I were arguing for the position of the United States in Israel, I would argue for it on a moral plane. Not so much a geopolitical plane. Is Israel a sensational ally? Of course. Are they the most extraordinary intelligence post we have in the world? Of course. But geopolitical arguments often give the impression of arguing power, strength. And if you lose that, you lose your credibility. But if your argument is morality, you may lose battles on occasion. But in the long run, you win the wars. So let's take a look. Let's take a look historically at Israel and the moral claims. I could make an argument, and I'd be prepared to defend an argument, that there is no better historical claim to Judea and Samaria than the Jews. It was not our fault. It was not our fault that we were kicked out by the Babylonians in the 6th century BC or the Romans shortly after the Christian period. And don't say we were kicked out and left. They may have been defeated in battle, but they left a legacy and a memory and a morality that pinions a claim that in my judgment is still legitimate. But if we want to talk about geopolitics, then listen, you want to talk about who had the most effective rule in the Middle East for the longest period of time, it's probably Rome. I haven't seen any recent claim that we should give the West Bank to Italy because of that. The Turks ruled it for roughly 400 years, roughly from 1500 to the end of World War I, but they made the mistake of ending up on the wrong side, allied with Germany in World War I, but they had it for 400 years, ruled it badly, ineffectively. But you mean, were they sovereign? Yes. But I haven't seen any serious Turkish claims to any part of Israel. Well, people say that's ancient history. I mean, who's going back to the diaspora? Who's going back to Rome? Who's going back to Turkey? Let's talk about this century. Okay, let's talk about this century. Turkey had the Middle East. They had what was Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. Didn't have Saudi Arabia in any effective degree. There was no Saudi Arabia at the time, but they had all of this. There were none of these other countries that we now know at the turn of the century. Britain and France at the end of World War I simply took the Middle East from Turkey. Said we're going to divide it up between us. France took what is now Syria and Iraq, Syria and Lebanon. Britain took what is now Iraq, Jordan, and Israel. But at the time, it was simply a division between the two winning powers. And then the Balfour Declaration, of course, said someplace out of the British portion in this division would come a homeland for the Palestinians. And that was confirmed at the San Remo Agreement in 1920, confirmed by the League of Nations. They said, fine, someplace in this territory there is going to be a homeland for the Jews. And then what happened? The Emir Abdullah, the grandfather of the present King Hussein, had probably the best Arab army in the area. And he'd been dealt out. He didn't get a country. And so he decided he would move on Damascus, which was in the French territory. And the French say to the British, listen, he's in your part, you do something. So what did the British do? They create the country of Transjordan, across, east of the Jordan River. It was 80% of the then existing Palestinian mandate. 80%. And on the day the country of Transjordan was created, it was closed. to Jewish settlement. And what few Jewish settlers were there were expelled or worse. And was there an outcry from world Jewry? Don't give me this argument about are the Jews willing to give up land for peace. They gave up 80% of the mandate in the hopes of getting peace. And then what happens during the 20s and 30s? You have terrorism on both sides. I'm not going to get into an argument here as to who was better or worse. You had incidents of terrorism on both sides in the remaining mandate. The British had a terrible problem trying to keep peace among anybody. And finally, they create a commission called the Peel Commission as to how the mandate should be divided, 1937. Britain would keep Jerusalem. The Arabs would get the West Bank and the Negev. The Jews would get northern Israel. It's a rough division. I want to emphasize again what this division was. Britain would keep Jerusalem. The Arabs would get the West Bank and the Negev. We would get the rest. And who accepted it? We did. Jews did. Who turned it down? The Arabs, when they could have had the West Bank and the Negev and the mandate remaining in Jerusalem. Don't tell me we didn't give up land for peace or were willing to. 1938, the Jewish Agency itself makes a suggested partition of the remainder of the mandate. Jerusalem would now be divided under the Jewish Agency suggested partition between the British and the Jews. The Arabs would still get the West Bank and most of the Negev. Jews would get northern Israel, turned down by the Arabs. Now, this is the Jewish Agency making the suggestion. After the war, 46, the Jewish Agency makes another suggestion. Jerusalem would be internationalized. No suggestion that it be in Israel, part of Israel, internationalized. Arabs would get the West Bank. Finally, there was a suggestion because of settlements that had been made, finally in the Negev a bit, in the northern part of the Negev, that the Jews should have the Negev in northern Israel. Who turns down? The Arabs turn it down. United Nations partition. Jerusalem, again, is to be an international zone administered by the United Nations. Arabs get the West Bank. Jews get northern Israel and Negev. I don't need to tell you who turns it down. It isn't the Jews. It's the Arabs. Union Jack comes down May 15th, 1948. We're attacked from all sides. How we survived, I don't know, but somehow through sheer grit and blood, we managed to hold on and create a country and get a de facto armistice. And Jordan holds the West Bank from 1949 to 1967. I didn't see any suggestions of a Palestinian state in the West Bank. And now in terms of giving back land in the hopes of getting peace, we are attacked again from all sides. In 56, and we take the Sinai. We're attacked in 67, we take the Sinai. We were attacked in 73, we take the Sinai. And each occasion we give it back. Finally, to their credit, to their heroic credit, we get a peace treaty with Egypt. And I say to their credit because that was a heroic and difficult step for Egypt to take. And I understand there have been fissures and fractious disputes. But the treaty is holy. And so long as the treaty holds, there can be no major war in the Middle East. There can be terrorist attacks on our beaches. We can have children thrown off the roofs of buildings. But so long as that treaty holds, There will not be major war. And we gave up land, and we got a treaty. And from the time of David Ben-Gurion, when he was prime minister onward, we have been willing to negotiate with every Arab monarch, prime minister, president that has existed. Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, whoever else would meet. Only Egypt would meet. It is not Israel that is obdurate in this process. And I don't think I've ever seen a more extraordinary exchange than I saw on June 22nd, 1982. Israel had been involved in southern Lebanon. The massacres had occurred at Shatila and Sabra at the camps. You remember the television coverage and how much Israel, we were blamed for it. And Prime Minister Begin was here. Tremendous hostility simply because it came right on the heels of the pictures on Time magazine. Remember the bodies on the cover of Time magazine? Prime Minister Begin was here and he had a meeting with about 60 senators. One senator who was still in the Senate, but not here tonight, after there'd been some exchange, got up and said in terms of Shatila and Sabra and the settlements, he says, "Don't tell me we can't question your actions, Mr. Prime Minister. We're footing the bill." Begin said, "Don't threaten us with cutting off your aid. It will not work. I am not a Jew with trembling knees. I am a proud Jew with 3,700 years of civilized history. Nobody came to our aid when we were dying in the gas chambers and ovens. Nobody came to our aid when we were striving to create our country. We paid for it. We fought for it. We died for it. We will stand by our principles, and we will defend them when necessary, and if required, we will die for them again, with or without your aid. Don't threaten me, Senator." That is what has not changed. Don't threaten us. We are prepared. I think Israel, frankly, would give up more land than I would give up. In the same situation, my policy would be not 1 inch. And as far as I'm concerned, we do not negotiate. Whether that as a Republican be David Duke in Louisiana or Yasser Arafat in Tunis, we do not negotiate. So what should the policy of this country be? In concert with Israel, this would be the statement: we seek not to impose our system on others. We shall, however, against all odds, preserve that system for ourselves. America and Israel, now and forever, one and inseparable, will survive. And if necessary for survival, we will fight. And without question, if we fight, we will win. Shalom.
Senator Packwood, shalom to you and thank you. And Senator Mitchell, thank you tonight also. There are a variety of private receptions in the hotel after we adjourn. You are more than welcome to attend those receptions. They are not AIPAC functions, but I hope you enjoy them.
An American Profile on C-SPAN. Take a front row seat for in-depth conversation with the nation's leaders on C-SPAN's American Profiles. This hour-long series, aired throughout the year, features political figures, business leaders, journalists, educators, and others who shape our political culture. It's fascinating and unrehearsed, with insight you can't get anywhere else. C-SPAN, open to the public.
Go behind the scenes of the events you follow on C-SPAN with the C-SPAN Update. Designed specially for you, the update offers articles about our coverage, profiles of Washington insiders, and program highlights every week. So call 1-800-845-9000 for your subscription to the C-SPAN Update. And as a gift, we'll send you Gavel to Gavel, a guide to watching the House and Senate. Isn't it time you got an update?
This week on Book Notes.
Europeans had erased the memory of this event. I thought they had succeeded in doing that. And the more I talked to people, the more communities I visited, the more I realized that nothing had been erased. All of those memories were there, and they were smoldering just below the surface. That, for example, surprised me. A second thing that surprised me was that some countries that have excellent reputations abroad for what they supposedly did during the war actually had very bad historical records, but that through skillful public manipulation of the press or symbols, they had managed to make the rest of the world think that their record was better than what it actually was. That surprised me a lot.
An interview with Judith Miller about her new work, One by One by One, Facing the Holocaust. In the book, the author examines how people from 6 countries remember the Holocaust. Sunday, beginning at 8 and 11 p.m. Eastern Time.
Get involved. Be part of a media event. Tune in to the National Press Club on C-SPAN. Politicians, heads of state, public figures, the world's newsmakers address the Washington Press Corps every week, and you've got a front row seat. Saturdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, 3 p.m. Pacific. Only on C-SPAN.
In 1979, America's first public affairs network became available to 3 million households. C-SPAN's unique programming, local, state, national, and international, is now brought to 50 million homes around the nation. We value the cable television industry, local affiliates, and viewers who are committed to keeping C-SPAN open to the public.
Up next, the former president of France, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, fields a few questions from reporters in the White House driveway following a meeting with President Bush. D'Estaing served as president of France from 1974 until 1981.